and why we propose this as one of the big questions that Frontiers would tackle this semester. So as many of you know, the Natural Capital Project has just started to launch a new urban initiative, and this is a departure from a lot of our past work, which has really emphasized landscapes that are kind of defined by their lack of people, right? So watersheds, forested landscapes, seascapes, places where we're really concerned about elevating the values of nature and linking those values to impacts to ecosystem services like sediment retention or pollination or fisheries production. But we've been increasingly encouraged to enter the urban space and really think about the interactions between environment and sustainability and green space and nature within the boundaries of cities. And of course, cities are defined precisely by the presence of people, by how important people are in those sort of coupled social ecological systems. And so it's no longer okay for us to just think about these biophysical changes and the models that we use for carbon sequestration or sediment or other types of environmental flows. We really have to fundamentally think about the people, the communities where these interventions are taking place, and how their values and their needs and their preferences can be elevated in those kinds of conversations we're having about in urban sustainability and urban greening. So there's clearly a growing demand for this kind of work, and if those of you who are involved in city or regional planning know there's a huge emphasis now on this idea of green infrastructure or nature-based solutions to address urban sustainability challenges. So that's the idea that urban green spaces can provide a suite of benefits. Some things like stormwater mitigation or water quality improvement, air quality mitigation. They provide recreational benefits to people in a whole suite of other things. And this is translating into real sort of policy changes, whether they're million tree campaigns or big green infrastructure master planning campaigns. And a lot of this focuses on questions about where should we make these kinds of interventions, how do we green communities, how do we deal with issues about environmental justice and sustainability and improve the quality of life for residents living in cities all around the world. And a key question of this is sort of how much green is enough, where do we put that green, who benefits from those kinds of interventions, whose values are we elevating in those conversations. And so this conversation is part of starting a broader dialogue about how we do nature-based interventions or think about urban sustainability within the boundaries of cities. And there's obviously many pros to thinking about nature in cities. Nature provides a lot of benefits, whether it's recreational benefits or aesthetic benefits. But there's also a lot of consequences potentially to these interventions that we want to be aware of. So things like equity of access. Is our green space equitably distributed within cities? Previous work has shown that green space is often highly stratified by income. So are we considering where and who is benefiting the most from these kinds of interventions? There's a lot of issues with environmental amenities that may be actually disamenities to communities. So are there issues of gentrification that we need to consider? Are green spaces perceived as safe? Or are there issues related to crime or pollution that we also need to consider when we think about the values of nature in cities? So the big question that we're tackling today is sort of what does urban greening or what does urban sustainability mean for traditionally marginalized, low-income or vulnerable communities? And as we think about urban nature, how are we considering the needs of all residents, of all communities, of all groups, and their preferences, not just those of more privileged communities? And as I started to ask and think about these questions in the Twin Cities and in some of the work we've been doing at NatCap, I was asking for ideas about who are experts that can speak to these topics, that have experience working in communities where these are real issues. And these four women that are before you now are the names that I heard over and over again were the people that should be part of this conversation that had something really important to say. So I'm really grateful to have all of them here and looking forward to getting a chance to hear from them about some of their own individual experiences as they work both in the Twin Cities and other places around some of these complex issues. So I'm going to introduce each of them really quickly, and then you'll get a chance to hear from all four of our speakers, and then we'll have some time at the end for discussion in panel format. So Kenya, I'm going to let you just settle in for a minute. But I'll start with Jenna Fletcher. Jenna is the program director for the Trust for Public Lands here in the Twin Cities. She's also planning commissioner for the city of Stillwater, so wears a couple of different hats that are relevant to this issue. Jenna's worked on things like the Greening the Green Line planning group, so thinking about how we can integrate open space as we create new transit opportunities within the cities. She has a lot of experience on urban smart growth. She's a Denella Meadows Leadership Fellow. She's an alum of the University of Minnesota. She's a great set of experiences related to this topic. Next to her is Kate Derickson. Kate's a McKnight Land Grant Professor in the Department of Geography here at the University of Minnesota. She's worked a lot on community-based initiatives. She thinks a lot about community voices and community advocacy and how we can elevate those when we're making environmental decision-making. She's done work on redevelopment post-Katrina in communities in Glasgow, Scotland, and is currently working in West Atlanta. She's done a lot of work in the past on community organizing, has a planning background as well. Karen Monahan is at the end, and Karen is a senior organizer with the North Star chapter of the Sierra Club. She's co-chair of their Diversity Council. She has a real reputation as a leader in environmental justice issues in the Twin Cities. She's been instrumental in the Beyond Coal campaign. She's a Wellstone Action Fellow. She's worked on the Urban Heat Island program at the Science Museum of Minnesota. So another great set of experiences. I'm really glad you could join us. Kenny is on the Met Council Transportation Advisory Board. She was the 2012 Bush Foundation Leadership Fellow, recognized for a lot of her work on community organizing, working in North Minneapolis as part of the Northside Economic Opportunity Network. She's part of the Black Women's Business Alliance and has done a lot of work on elevating the issues of importance to the communities that she works in big decisions about transportation and planning and development here in the Twin Cities. So Jenna, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and kick us off.
Again, Jenna Fletcher with the Trust for Public Lands, and just so you get a quick context, the Trust for Public Land is a national nonprofit, so we have 30 offices around the country. I'm in the Minnesota office, housed here in the city of St. Paul. And, you know, I work in what's called the Parks for People program. To touch on what Bonnie said, we really believe that parks are about people using them and benefiting from them. We see multiple benefits, Bonnie touched on them, that parks can provide. I mean, kind of the obvious ones, we all know, environmental benefits, air quality benefits, etc. The health benefits, we all know about fitness benefits. But and really growing evidence about the mental health benefits of parks, which is really quite exciting. And then also, I think there's a new frontier of health benefits, though, and that's really thinking about how the air quality improvements and water quality improvements help with urban residents' health, and also around urban heat island mitigation. And so that's actually a frontier that we're just starting to do some work using our national GIS expertise. And I'll talk about that in a minute. It's really relevant here in the Twin Cities, and you may know about this than I, but the urban heat island impact is pretty notable here in the Twin Cities. By one source, it's actually the third highest in the country in terms of, as you know, I'm sorry. Could everybody hear me actually? Okay, sorry. So the reason why urban heat island is an issue for urban residents, as you all probably know, is think about those residents who don't have access to a way away from the heat, that they can't afford or don't have access to air conditioning, that their housing situation is such that they don't have air conditioning. We do believe that green space nearby is really important. In fact, we have a national campaign that's just starting where we hope to see every urban resident within a 10-minute walk of a park. And that's really important. Right now, there's over 100 million people that don't have a 10-minute access to a park. Here in the Twin Cities, we actually have a pretty good 10-minute walk score, if you will. About 93% of residents in the Twin Cities, in Minneapolis and St. Paul, I should say, are within a 10-minute walk of a park. But that still means that there's gaps. There's still places where residents don't have access to a park. And we do a lot of mapping around that, and we're layering that 10-minute walk need with the urban heat island, potential pockets of urban heat island. And so we're starting to do just a little bit of mapping and using the EPA Environmental Justice Index as a measure for where are there people that are affected by urban heat islands. So that's something that we're going to be working on in a couple of areas in the Twin Cities in the next 2 months, in fact. But, you know, all this idea of data and mapping and identification, it's really about the people. And that's what I care about, is working with the residents who care about parks. Everybody loves their parks. So I've got a couple stories to share about real parks that we've made, or one we've made and one we're working on. We are implementers, and in the process of being implementers, we work with community, we work with cities, we work with funders, we work with university, we work with a lot of partners. And how do we do that work? Increasingly, we're focusing on how do we make sure our work, our implementation, benefits those populations that most need green space. So my first story is about a park that just opened this month, and it's in the Frogtown neighborhood of St. Paul. And it's a very large, 13-acre, very large by new urban park standards today, great park that has a farm element as well as a park element. And we worked with the residents of the Frogtown neighborhood, which is itself very diverse. I have some stats. I think it's 37% and 34% Asian Pacific Island, 30% Black African American, 21% white, 10% Hispanic, and lots of new immigrants from Somalia, among other countries. And basically, we had some Frogtown leaders come to us and say, we need a park, we want to do some urban farming. And through our expertise, we learned about some land that was for sale from the Wilder Foundation, and we negotiated a significant discounted price. And we were instrumental in the real estate component of making this happen. But we also were involved in all the fundraising that was required, both public and private fundraising, and also community engagement and working with the community. And in fact, we helped form what's a new organization that will be running the farm. It's called Frogtown Farm. And that organization is small but mighty and has grand plans for the 6-acre urban farm that's at the top of the hill of this 13-acre park. So the grand opening was just a joyous event on October 3rd. Over 900 residents, many from the neighborhood, who walked up and said, I didn't even know this existed before. The farm component will emphasize some of the ethnic farming practices and really kind of provide some education for residents. We'll provide some produce for restaurants that are nearby, many of them very ethnic restaurant offerings. And it's, I think, proving itself to be a really great asset in the community that's direly in need of a park. In that case, that was a neighborhood in St. Paul that had the least amount of park space for the children there. We have 7,000 children in the neighborhood of 13,000 residents. So that's a great success story. The other story I want to share is about a new future park, and I think we're going to do even better community engagement in this new park. It's an area just it's on the Green Line by Lexington and University. It's actually on Briggs Avenue, right behind Gordon Parks High School. There's land for sale. The city of St. Paul, again, recognizes the need for a park, and we are, again, involved in purchasing the land, doing community engagement, doing fundraising, etc. What's really interesting about this particular place is, unlike Frogtown, there's no sense of neighborhood. There is no neighborhood. It's really a sea of parking lots, some social service providers, a couple of high schools, and a couple of affordable housing communities. Skyline Towers is the most notable. You've seen that high white tower off of Highway 94. That's housing for mostly Somali immigrants, about 900 Somali immigrants, and some Southeast Asian residents as well. And what we hope to do is what we call upstream community engagement. Not park design, not wait till the end, we have all the money in hand and say, what do you want in the park, but really use community engagement. Use the park as a way to bring people together to say, hey, we can come together around this park. And identify what are the values and shared values that then can be brought to the design of the park. So I won't go into great other detail, but those are the two stories I wanted to share about how can we implement, make things really happen on the ground in a way that's really serving the residents in a different way than the past.
Okay, so as Bonnie said, I'm a geographer. That can mean a lot of different things. I don't know anything about urban heat islands. I am a human geographer and an urban geographer, and have got into geography and the kind of research that I do because I was interested in how we make cities and how historically marginalized communities find kind of influence and are able to shape what happens in cities. And I got involved in environmental issues because over and over again, the communities that I was working with had those issues at the forefront of their minds. So as we were designing research projects together, environmental governance practices, envisioning environmental futures, managing environmental amenities, engaging in planning processes and things like that, were the things that were really on the forefront of the minds of the people that I was working with. So that's the way that I come to the kind of work that I've been doing. When we got the prompt, when I was thinking about what I wanted to say in the 5 or so minutes that we have, I went back to the prompt that Bonnie sent, which was something like, how do we green our most vulnerable communities? And then there were some things underneath it. And I was thinking about this phrase, how do we green? And I was thinking about the we, assuming it's the kind of assembled people here, and then this idea of greening as like a verb, to green, something we would do. And I guess the question is something like, how do people assembled here take action relative to what we probably all know is the uneven access to environmental amenities or environmentally desirable places to live, or as I can often thinking about locally undesirable land uses, things like that. And so as I was thinking about what I wanted to say about how do we take action in relation to this problem, I thought of two anecdotes. Well, I thought of a lot, but there's only time for two. And the first one is from my dissertation research in Mississippi after Hurricane Katrina. I was, again, kind of thinking about political economy of land use, actually, when I got down there, more than I was thinking about environmental change. And I was working in historically black neighborhoods in Mississippi, not in New Orleans. Mississippi was a very different context for a lot of different reasons. And I started working with this one organization in particular, this woman who was kind of developing an organization. And before the storm, she was a blue-collar worker. After the storm, she became a really powerful and compelling advocate for her community and the needs. And when these major global NGOs were kind of looking around for how to do work in this region, a lot of them she came up a lot and people got really attracted to her. And so one global NGO gave her what can only be described as basically a money bomb. Basically like, okay, it's 45 days after the storm, we want to make things happen in this region. I think the logic was we recognize that this needs to be community-led. Here's a whole bunch of money to make something good happen here. This is a person who had no computing skills, no professional training, no experience writing grants, no experience budgeting on that level, no experience tracking and measuring deliverables or anything like that, which was fine for the first year. And then after a year, this global NGO started saying, like, well, show us how you spent our money. Show us how you affected change. Show us how, write grants to leverage the money that we gave you. And she sort of was like, I have no idea what you're talking, I don't know how to do these things. And so she and I were working together to try to figure out how we could, what to do about that. And in the process of that, this same NGO came to her and said, hey, listen, we are putting together this global solidarity of women, a project that's about women's global solidarity around climate change. And we want you to be part of this group. And we're gonna fly you around the world, and you guys are gonna give presentations together at places like the Humphrey and places like this, and you're gonna talk about the need for women's solidarity around climate change issues. And she said, all right, that sounds cool. And they made a whole bunch of shiny brochures, and her picture was on them, and so were a lot of other women's pictures. And right before she left, she called me and said, can I run through my talk with you before I get on the plane to go to wherever she was going? And she ran through her talk, and the whole talk was about the need for a change in the political climate in Mississippi. And I said, I think that's a great talk. I think that they mean global warming. And she said, I don't have anything to say about global warming. And I said, yeah, okay, well, here's what they're thinking. They're thinking what you guys are all thinking: hurricanes, climate intensification, vulnerability, climate change, women. And she said, why would I talk about, I don't have anything to say about that. In terms of the risks and vulnerabilities and the things that I care about and the things that I think about, that is so far removed from what's a priority to me. And I said, you have a decision to make. So she went and did it because she's like up for the challenge, you know. But it suggested a lot of things. It was 10 years ago, and it's really stuck with me because it tells me a lot about what kinds of things we take for granted in terms of what is an issue to people. And that longer anecdote raises a lot of questions for me about how the various we's assemble reinforce a kind of marginalization through the forms of engagement that we take as given or for granted. The second, quicker anecdote is about a woman who I work with in West Atlanta. I work in the Proctor Creek watershed, which is one of the most polluted watersheds in the country, with a stewardship council of residents. It's in Northwest Atlanta. The watershed is 90% African American, and the stewardship council is made up of residents who are trying to kind of shape how different initiatives in the watershed play out. And there's this one woman in particular who is at every meeting and a really great advocate for her watershed. But whenever EPA comes around, whenever other organizations come around and say, hey, look, we've got all these trash bags we can donate to you. We've got all these gloves we can donate to you. We called Chick-fil-A, and they're sending their corporate people out to help you guys do a cleanup. She says, are you kidding me? I'm not picking up those tires. I didn't put those tires there. I didn't put that construction debris there. I'm not picking it up. And I love her because I love that reaction because I think it troubles, it explodes the brains of so many people, because this idea of environmental citizenship, especially in the way that it's kind of articulated in some of our environmental justice communities, reproduces some kind of unfair obligation to make good environments that many other people do not bear. And I think about this when I walk along Minnehaha Creek, which is in my backyard, as opposed to Proctor Creek, which is in her backyard. I don't have to do anything to enjoy Minnehaha Creek. And her argument is, I shouldn't have to do anything. I didn't put those tires there. I'm not picking them up. And so those two anecdotes come to mind when I think about what action can we take to green these places. And it gets into this broader approach that I have in my own research around resourcing communities to envision and realize the environmental futures they want to see, rather than importing approaches to greening that were born in the ivory tower and then are implemented in communities. And so I could say a lot more, but I won't.
All right, am I good?
Yeah.
So I want to just briefly talk about this idea of environmental justice around access to land and power. Just to put kind of all of this in context, access to land, when you think about that, we are connected to Mother Earth, and without it, we die. So when you think about water, air, food, soil, and the list goes on. And then you think of how that impacts our mental and physical health. Then you think about access to power to make decisions around land and who benefits and who doesn't. I just want to go back to 1492 when you think of colonization and how this country was colonized on an environmental justice issue, and it was built on an environmental justice issue. Think about taking land from Native Americans who were already here, taking that land forcefully, brutally, taking power, and then you go to 1619, Jamestown, the first slaves that were brought over here, who built this country, the land, toiled the land, free labor, a free handout, right? An environmental justice issue. To 1863, still happened afterwards, but just Emancipation Proclamation. Then to 1965, the Voting Rights Act, till now. So when you think about those crucial dates in history around access to land, power, that is like, there is a certain group of folks who had access to the power and access to the land and determined for other folks how their lives would be for a long time. And still, it doesn't just stop there. At 1965, everything's great. We see, I mean, we have been a slave country way longer than we have been a free country. So I think in order to understand this, all the work that folks are doing up here, to put it in context, that it didn't just like happen that way. And fast forwarding to now, to some of the work that's being done in the environmental justice community around access to power and access to land. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. How many guys are familiar with the Pollution Control Agency? Right? So they make some decisions around permitting, and seeing how this system has left so many people out in terms of access to that power, you know, getting in there has been somewhat of a challenge, but with excellent organizing, folks coming together and claiming their power, we now have a spot at the table. And so back around 3 years ago, the community sat down and we were tired of dealing with permit after permit after permit. Are they going to get a permit on, you know, to pollute in our community? And we said, instead dealing with permit after permit, what if we just like say, let's dream big and let's just try to change the system and have an environmental justice framework. So we sat down, we wrote a letter to the commissioner. We had a few asks, and basically it was around creating an environmental justice plan for the state of Minnesota with the community and having regularly quarterly meetings with the environmental justice community and setting aside a budget to hire somebody to do environmental justice work and a budget where you're going to hire an environmental justice intern. And my student Sharanthi Gunathilaka, who works on the Urban Heat Island with me at the Science Museum, was the first environmental justice intern for the state of Minnesota. And they've continued this program. So because that was in place, we now have the Clean Power Plan. Are folks familiar with the Clean Power Plan? So this is an awesome opportunity for all of us in shaping what the Clean Power Plan looks like for the state of Minnesota. So 2 areas that we're focused on is making sure that it doesn't disproportionately impact environmental justice communities and making sure that we benefit from some of the solutions. So the HERC garbage incineration, it's right there by Target Field. It burns garbage, big polluter in the community. It's the 3rd largest in the country when it comes to racial disparities in terms of garbage incineration. And burning garbage is considered under the law, they did a great job lobbying, a renewable energy, right? So it's like the equivalent of solar and wind. So there's tax breaks they get because it's considered a renewable, and it's also within the Clean Power Plan, it's considered a credit. So you get credit if you're burning garbage, which the HERC sells their energy to Excel Energy. There's also the cap and trade piece. So if Excel Energy buys the dirty energy, they can say, well, you know, we get a credit for this, so maybe we can pollute more carbon over at Sherco, right? So it's like, they got a nice little thing going on. So we want to make sure that we are at the table, we're having these conversations and making sure that we address these disparities and that there's real solutions. So the burden isn't on environmental justice communities. Also, the second campaign that I'm working on is with the Just Solar campaign. We know solar is a solution, right? So wind and solar, having access to it, making sure that people can afford it, making sure there's spaces, you know, there's programs for folks who may rent their properties, and also who is going to have access to these kind of jobs, the training, who is going to be, when you look at the disparities in this state around job disparities between, you know, blacks and whites, we have to make sure that as we're working on these different issues that we're trying to deal with it in a holistic way and deal with so many of the disparities that we see across the board. And so this campaign is built to try to address as many disparities as we possibly can. So access to the solar, access to the job training, access to the jobs, and working with businesses of color to make sure that we're also creating wealth within the community. So this is, you know, a small piece to some of the bigger issues that we discuss around environmental justice, but I also just want to leave it with, when you look at the history and you look currently, these issues that we're all dealing with and working on are really, they're symptoms of a bigger issue. And to me, that is really a spiritual issue and a shift in consciousness where we see ourselves in each other, regardless of race, class, where we live in this world, and we also see our connection to the earth. Because when we actually have that deeper shift and that connection, we wouldn't want to do anything that hurts any other human being, and we wouldn't want to do anything that hurts our Mother Earth as well. Thank you.
Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Good. So I certainly support and agree with everything that's been said and the stories. It's good to hear. I guess the first thing I'll say is that history is important. History is important not because we need to feel guilty about it, right? But because we need to understand the impact that our decisions, our thinking, our investments have had on humanity, and particularly communities of color and low wealth populations. I don't say low income, I say low wealth, because it's bigger than the income. It's also about the amenities, the public goods, right, that have not been invested in. So it's a bigger piece than just income. So just note that's your new language. Low wealth, not low income. And historically, I mean, Karen used the term environmental justice communities. How many of you heard that term? It's a big term in transportation. It's how the federal government identified communities of color and low wealth populations, vulnerable folks, that is adults, aging adults, disabled folks, children, youth. It's a broad definition, but it's about, it's a term that's used under the Title VI, Civil Rights Act, Title VI, which is a law that protects all these vulnerable populations in many instances, but it definitely is something that's used in transportation, right? It's simply illegal to not provide access to these communities, transportation access. It has to exist in our communities. If it doesn't, it's the law. So that's kind of just an example of how it gets applied or how people think about Title VI in transportation. And it's under the term environmental justice communities. And why the history is important, I'll talk to you a little bit about that when we talk about the Greenway, but I want to go back to this common good, public goods, right? Understanding that part of the history is the lack of investment in the common public goods, right? That means that making sure that all the parks have the same adequate amenities, right? The levees broke in New Orleans, right? That was because there was a lack of investment in that public good, right? Because of where it was located, it wasn't prioritized, right? As something that should have been invested in. That's a public good. Our roads, infrastructure, these are public goods. School system, these are public goods. It should have the same sort of, it should have equitable investment. What does that mean? That means that you invest in the need, right? So the need has to be invested in. I can give you an example of, I worked on the Above the Fall Commission. How many of you have heard of the Above the Fall plans? It's the redevelopment of the entire Mississippi River throughout our twin cities mostly. Okay, so it might be something you might be interested in getting involved in the committee of citizens, and I love them to death, but they ran me crazy when I go to my grandparents. They were adamant about what they wanted. But what they didn't understand is that when we talk about the investment in public goods, you have the west side of the river and you have the east side. The west side is particularly in Minneapolis, is predominantly North Minneapolis in the area that we were studying. The east side is northeast, and so you have a different racial makeup there in itself. Generationally, who's at the table, but also racial groups, ethnic groups, if you will. And in the plan, on the east side of the river, you have investments in the public goods, there's recreation, there's a beach being developed, there's a bunch of, you can go over there and just, whoa, you're gonna have fun, right? I was looking forward to it. I still am, but and you look at the west side of it, all you see is the preservation of wetlands, which is great, right? That's greening, right? But what about the access? There's no real access points to the river on the west side, right? You have to go, pretty much people created their own pathways. You could really look, so how do you really get down and touch the water? You can't unless you create your own pathway, or unless you go to, which I live in Northfield now. I can get on in Northfield. I can travel all through but I can't do that in North Minneapolis. I can only see it. And I can only see it from a stoop that stands up high. I can't go down. So the green is there, but I don't have access to it really, right? And so, but in this plan, there's no connectivity about the lack of access and what that means for people psychologically. You think about depression, you think about stress, people just want to go to the river. They want to go, right? Sometimes you just want to put your feet in it, it's dirty, but this is what you do. Right? You want to throw rocks, I'm from Illinois, Kankakee, Illinois, small town, 45 minutes south of Chicago. I grew up here for the last 33 years of my life. I know I'm only 26, but I grew up here 33 years. And where I'm from, we played on the river, right? We threw rocks. It was a part of our lifestyle. Nature, green space, gardens, it was not an issue. We literally would walk through our neighborhood and eat, right, off the trees and things like that. We eat berries off the fences, crab apples off the trees, pears, whatever, and it was never a problem. So I grew up understanding a connectivity to nature and green space in a different way that does not exist currently, in the same way in the community I grew up here in Minneapolis, which is north side. So I can't even go over north and find a pond to really sit at, right? I have to go to Crystal, I have to go to Robbinsdale, or I have to go now to the senior building in Heritage Park, which is new. So there's not even a space for me to go and meditate. So green space is extremely important for a lot of different reasons. And considering the tornado that happened in North Minneapolis that kind of, damaged some of the green space of trees, if you will, which we're happy to have more trees planted, but it really makes you think about the importance of the trees. I've never seen the sky so open in North Minneapolis. It's obvious because the trees are gone. So going back to the river, so there's this opportunity to develop new green space, right? Or to develop access points and opportunities for people to actually enjoy the green space. But again, the disparities is about the side of the river it's on, right? So on one side, you have access to not only actually the water and the land, et cetera. You have access to recreational opportunities, right? For your family, for children, but and this is the more wider side, okay? That's who's also at the table. Boomers, but that's who's at the table. On the other side, you have a predominantly African-American community. Yes, it's diverse, very much so. We're the largest population there. for some time now. And where you have a lot of these stress points, you have all these, a lot of youth, like it's more young people live in North Minneapolis than anywhere. Under age of 25, they're the largest population. So, but it's family. It's an environment where families live. So we have a park right along the same West River Park Road, where the Mississippi, right? There's a park with no name, right in front of Cola Blast, right? There's a park there that doesn't have a name, it doesn't have a bench, it doesn't have a seesaw, it doesn't have a piece of sand. I mean, you understand? So it's there, but what purpose does it serve? How do the people who live around it or in close proximity access it? They can't. They can just come there and sit, as we do for fireworks and things like that, but there's no way to use it. That's the whole point of it. It has to fit the interests, usage, needs of the people who might use it, right? We have to attract that, and that's the importance of when we're talking about developing green space. And so the last piece, I'm also the secretary for the Northside Greenway. How many of you have heard of the North Minneapolis Greenway? Okay. So the Greenway, well, you've heard of the Midtown, right? I do a little work on that too. We could talk about me another time, but I'll just say this. So in the Greenway, part of the reason why I got involved in it is because what struck me is that along this 12-mile route, proposed route, there was a community engagement process done. And by the way, community engagement could also be just tokenism. If you have no real purpose or intent to really respect what people are saying and use it in a way that will advance their interest, then it doesn't, it's just a checkbox. So it's a sexy term like equity, right? So the real thing behind it is our purpose, integrity, and intent. So the engagement work that happened was like 60% of it, I believe, something like that. And if Sarah sees this from the Minneapolis Health Department, she'll correct me. A large percentage of the feedback was from Caucasian people, who majority did not even live in Minneapolis, for one. But they were influencing a decision about what green space should exist there. So currently the Greenway doesn't exist. We'll be building something. It's a concept now. And it's running right through the middle of a neighborhoods. It's running right through 5-6 neighborhoods for 12 miles. And the majority of the people who live along this route are of color. African American, Latino, there's a growing population of, I don't like the term immigrant, I just say New Americans. But we have indigenous people who live there. And they were the least of the folks who added to the comments about what this Greenway should be. But they were also the majority renters, right? So I got involved because I was saying, well, damn, I live on the route where the Greenway is being proposed, and nobody never talked to me. I never got a notice in the mail from the city of Minneapolis or anything. Why? Because I wasn't a homeowner, right? That's another barrier. I wasn't a homeowner, so therefore somehow I wasn't sought out, although my rent pays the mortgage that contributes to the tax base of the homeowner, right? So I still think I'm valuable. So at any rate, I got involved and said, well, what does this mean for other renters? It's another level. And how do we make sure that people of color, where the hell did this Greenway idea come from? So we got to the bottom of it, and it was this, guy, young white guy, cool, nice people, but he thought it would be a great idea to put a Greenway through the middle of North Minneapolis because it would help the health and et cetera. And the South Side has one. Why don't we have one? North Minneapolis deserves one. It was his idea. And so he took it to the city of Minneapolis, where he also works in the finance department. So he has some inside access, knowledge, resources, power, know how things work. And then you have the city of Minneapolis Health Department starting to this could be a good, healthy thing. Mind you, this didn't come from the people themselves. Remember that. That's point number one. But so what we're often facing is we're subjected to other people's ideas of what should exist in our community that may or may not fit our own perspective or interest, even if it does have a benefit. And the other piece is that then we're engaged in these processes. We're told you have to show up, give your opinion. Morally, you're supposed to care, but it wasn't my idea to begin. You didn't ask me. It didn't come from me. So anyways, that's the process of the Greenway. We found out how it got started. Yes, they work with people. Sure, that's what you do. To find out after you've already made a decision that you want to entertain a concept and in a community full of people that you're not connected to. It's not your community. You don't live here. So now we're at a place now where we've done all this engagement work with people of color and, you know, people of color and others. And we have all this leadership at the council. We've, done all the technical, yay, we got community involved stuff, right? But at the end of the day, we haven't done the grunt work of what does this really mean for gentrification? What is that? What does it mean? And how are we thinking about the history of this space? What happens when this Greenway is developed through here and it raises a tax base and most of the people who currently live around here can't afford to live here anymore? Why? Because if the income dropped for black people in Minnesota by nearly $5,000 just in 1 year, and most of the black people in Minnesota live over north, then that tells you they don't have enough money to live there to begin. So if you develop something that's going to increase the tax base, it's going to increase the rent and everything else, and that's going to impact their ability to stay there. So is the goal to get rid of folks, or is the goal to keep them there and keep them healthy? And if it is, then how do we really get there? So we haven't done that work. We're starting to do that now. It's a lot of chopped up pieces I threw out there. But I hope you get the point of access and making sure that green space we develop fits the interests, ideas, perspective, and needs of the communities directly that the space is being thought about in. And it should come from those people. But the thing that we can do that isn't getting into the weeds of all the cultural or racial things that don't want to do that is to invest in the common goods. That's our responsibility. That's policy. That's redirecting resources. That's advocating for what's right. Every park should have basic amenities. I shouldn't have to go to Edina or, Washburn neighborhood, somewhere over there, Southwest Minneapolis, just to watch movies in the park because you're scared somebody's going to shoot over there. No, the access to watching movies in the park should be made available to every park, not censored, right? So the common goods, knowing the history, and making sure that it comes from the interests, ideas, realities of the people. I'll stop there.
We give a round of applause. We just have a couple minutes left, so I want to give the opportunity to the audience to ask a couple of questions of our panelists. We'll just take one or two questions and then move the conversation down the hall to the commons area. But any quick questions?
Thank you very much. I was at a conference this past few days and there was all sorts of talks about environmental justice. And this is make me nervous to mention, but I've done work in Tanzania, and very often I hear comments about environmentalism is something that these low poverty areas can't afford to think about yet. It's not in their purview. They've got to worry about putting food on the table. And I heard that a little bit from your first story about the woman who said, I can't deal with climate change. But I heard the opposite, that that's not fair, from Kenya, and so I feel like it might be true on these extreme levels, but in truth I find it a very rude thing to assume that just because you're poor doesn't mean you can't care. So I just wonder if you have any comments.
Yeah, that wasn't, that's not my point at all. So I guess, but just to clarify, my point was rather that, that there are things that we take for granted about ways we might frame what matters that are consequences of the spaces we spend a lot of time thinking in. And that my argument is that the best, most important thing that we can do is resource communities to realize the futures that they want to see, whether those are environmental futures, whether those are political futures, and how those things come together. And in fact, my experience is that in every low-wealth community of color that I work in, environmental issues are at the forefront of their sets of concerns. So it's not that it's a different calculation than the one that I'm really familiar with, which is like, worry about the environment later, you have bigger problems. It's a formulation of the problem that is, let's understand, from you, how your particular approach to addressing what seem to be your most immediate problems or concerns and your long-term vision come together. And what's incompatible there are visions for development in Tanzania that are also important, right? So it's about not bringing in prepackaged trajectories or plans or approaches to environmental well-being, greening, economic development, or any of those things, and rather taking a posture of collaboration, which is about creating or contributing to capacity for whatever the future is that they want to see.
I just want to quickly say something to that. I don't think, very few things in life are like black or white. It's either this or that. There's so many other different factors that play into this. And I can just tell you something that is happening currently. Oftentimes, language sets agendas, right? And who's going to be at that table. And as we discuss power and all of that, they set, that language. But also, it comes to resources. So I'm working with a lot of different organizations who care deeply about environmental issues. But because environmental justice funding, for instance, is only like 2% within the environmental funding, which is limited itself. And not to say that you have to belong to an organization or something like that to care about the environment, but it is real that people do need resources to really have a huge impact on these issues. So like around the HERC, we have some organizations who do not have any funding to work on environmental justice issues. They're not environmental justice organizations, but they care deeply what happens to their community. So, but they're also dealing with issues around Minneapolis Works. They're also dealing with issues around voting rights. They're also dealing with issues around police brutality. So there's so many other issues that folks are dealing with. And I just think it's like, it's a lot of factors that play in that. They're still trying to be at that table with limited amount of resources. So as a community, part of power and access is, are we willing to give up our power, give up our resources? I don't want to say share, so folks can be at the table and have a voice and make their decisions.
The only thing I'll say is, so I come from a pretty big family. I'm like, I have like 57 first cousins, right? Like it's a bunch of us. And I moved here when I was 7, but we went home every summer until I was like 15. So my uncle, what he used to do was he would take at least 15 of us, and we'd go and collect cans and aluminum and clean up and stuff like that as kids, and that's how we made money. And so like we had to work, it wasn't optional. We have a large family, so I had a paper route, the paper. That's just the way it was. Great-grandmother raised 5 generations of us, and we just had to work. Otherwise, we'd probably get beat, just get on their nerves and stuff. But, so we were doing environmental work there and didn't know it because it was a part of our lifestyle. It wasn't a political concept or anything like that. There's a difference in that. So you don't really need permission to do the right thing. But I think it is about re-educating or reorientating people to understanding that they can play a role in dealing with young people. Deal with young people. Do it. I mean, I got 2 more years and I'm 30. And, but I'll tell you that I think we'll find way much more interest and make more progress. And their open minds, they don't have all these barriers we have to all this political jargon. They care and they want to be involved and they can be taught without the barriers that we have. And I'm saying all that to say that it's both and, it's not either or. There is an overwhelming amount of stress that does come when you live in concentrated environments that are concentrated with a lot of things. Poverty is not just income. Again, when we talk about the lack of investment in common goods, when you live in a place and you can't go sit somewhere and just look at a pond, like that's an issue psychologically. So there's a lot of stuff compounded. The amount of violence is just not normal. You understand how people have to disconnect from their humanity just to, I mean, it took me a long time, and I'm still processing this young girl getting slammed around in this classroom. It's psychologically just bothers my mind, right? And then I gotta go in an environment where this is normal. It's normal for the police to say, well, you're bad, so, I'm gonna shoot you, or whatever that is, right? It's normal for somebody to just do whatever. And so this is not normal. So it plays on your psyche in a lot of ways, and when you are concentrated in these environments, it creates other problems. And so you don't have the ability sometimes to look at the long range because you're operating in the emergency, the crisis. But there are some of us who have been blessed or who have to breathe just a little bit to be able to look at the long range to see what other folks are doing. I will tell you, I worked on the Transportation Advisory Board. How many of you heard of the TAB? Okay. It's our MPO for the state. It's in charge of regional development, regional planning. So the MPO creates the regional development plan for our region. 30-year planning. 30-year planning, so it allows me to see things, and I'm looking back at my community like, oh my gosh, we are not ready, oh my gosh. And so the long range it's difficult when you're, so it's both ends.
Please stick around, engage with our panelists. Let's give them one more round of applause.